Hey, friends, welcome to this unique Theology Raw episode. This is sort of outside of our normal schedule. I wanted to record an episode with my friend, Dr. Autin Knuppe, who is an expert in the Middle East, in terrorism, and all the things going on right now in the Middle East. I know a lot of people are thinking through this and are maybe confused at what's going on. So I wanted Autin to come in and talk to us about what is going on between Israel and Hezbollah and Iran and all the things that just keep escalating. So Dr. Autin Knuppe is an assistant professor of political science at Utah State University. Prior to his position at Utah State, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth College. He received his Ph.D. in political science from the Ohio State University in 2019, and his research interests include civilian survival during wartime, Middle East politics, and the role of religion in international politics. His first book is titled Surviving the Islamic State, Contention, Cooperation, and Neutrality in Wartime Iraq, published in 2024. So we talk about all things related to the current conflict in the Middle East. I found his perspective to be incredibly wise and fair and balanced and well researched. The guy knows so much about the Middle East, much more than I do, or I suspect many of you do. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Dr. Autin Knuppe. Hey, Autin, thanks so much for being part of this. I don't know, like an emergency or last minute Theology Raw podcast. This is outside of our normal schedule, and I'm having you on just because, gosh, there's so much going on in the Middle East, and it's hard to know with all the various news sources, which ones to trust, what's going on, how much is propaganda, and really just what do we know? You know, I mean, who is Hezbollah? What is going on? Are we on the brink of World War III? Who started this is one that, not that as a Christian that is the ultimate question, but I think it's important to kind of get our arms around everything. So let's jump in. Tell us about Hezbollah. Who is Hezbollah, and what's the relationship with Lebanon as a country?
Yeah, so Lebanon's a state that has a government where there are political parties that also have armed wings. And so it had a really nasty, devastating civil war between 1975 and the early 1990s. And what happened is some of these militias or militant organizations demobilized, or they formed political parties. So Hezbollah is a militant group, resistance organization started before Hamas. This is in the 1980s. And nowadays, it's a political party that has representation in the Lebanese parliament, and it has an armed wing. And so for the past 30 plus years, it's been committed to resisting the Zionist occupation, the Israeli government, and the state of Israel. And it does through militant wings. It also receives military and financial support from Iran. So Iran has something like 5 or 6 different proxy groups in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the West Bank and Gaza, which they use to provoke the Israelis because they don't have the same military strength as the state of Israel or the United States. So it's a proxy war, it's a political party, it's a resistance organization, all wrapped in one.
Is there tension between Hezbollah and the rest of the Lebanese government? Is that even, again, I might ask questions that might even betray a lot of ignorance here, but is that,
Yeah, so what happened was during World War I, after the Ottoman Empire collapses, the French colonized Lebanon and Syria, and it's one country called the Syria Mandate. After World War II, the French leave, and Lebanon becomes independent. But what they do is they form a constitution with ethnic power sharing. So they said the only way we can diffuse these ethnic tensions is by having quotas for each of the main ethnic groups in Lebanon. So you're going to have the Sunnis control one branch of government, the Christians control another, and the Shia another. And so they have sectarian and ethnic power sharing. And the problem is that these political groups also control key aspects of industry, education, hiring. So you have these massive patronage networks that all also have armed militias that come out of the civil war. And so you have economic fragility, you have ethnic tension, it's part of the wider Israel-Arab wars in the region. Yeah.
Okay. I'm pretty sure did you break off? Are you okay? Yeah, you're there. Okay, you froze for a second.
I got you.
And I have to apologize to you and my audience. I'm battling a severe allergy attack for the last 24 hours, which is why I look like I just woke. I did just wake up, but I look like I woke up at 2 a.m. right now. But it's not. It's 8 o'clock. So I apologize for the sniffles, and I also have my dog who's really clinging to me right now. You can't see him, but he's down here. So if you see my arm, I'm petting my dog.
A little hopeful, yeah.
Is Is Hezbollah a terrorist organization in your opinion? I know I think the United States and other countries have designated them that. Others might say it's a resistance movement or simply a armed militia, just like the IDF or the Navy, United States. How should we think through Hezbollah?
Yeah, so it's a political party. It is a terrorist organization. It targets civilians as well as uniformed soldiers. So it targets the Israel Defense Force and Israeli civilians. The predecessor to Hezbollah was the group responsible for the Marine barracks bombing in 1983 that caused the Americans to pull out. Right, so that's kind of a predecessor to that organization. So they're involved in terror. They're extraordinarily effective among Shia Lebanese communities because they also engage in social service provision. So they're a political party and an armed group, but they run schools and provide medical care and all the basic governance services that people need when the government's absent. So they're kind of all 3 or 4 of those functions wrapped in one.
Have you ever met anybody from Hezbollah? I know you spent a lot of time out there.
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay.
I've spent time in Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, the places that were attacked in the last 2 weeks. Some of those communities I've spent time in. I'm guessing I've met folks that are sympathetic to Hezbollah's a wider ideology or mission, but I tend, when I'm in that part of the road, I tend not to ask people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Is that you mentioned in passing? It is a terrorist organization, or it is involved in terror in that it targets civilians. Is that kind of one of the base definitions of to qualify as a terrorist organization? You target civilians. Is that?
So terrorism is one of these really fraught terms, right? We tend to think about it consisting of a couple of main components, right, or attributes. It's a non-state group that targets civilian populations for some political goal in order to scare, intimidate, coerce population to change course. So some folks talk about state terrorism, the Israelis targeting. I tend to think of that simply as indiscriminate violence or victimizing civilians. Terrorists are typically non-state groups. They have a political goal. And the goal is not just to kill people and break things, it's to scare, intimidate, and force the target to change their behavior. So that's what makes it different than mass murder, right? Mass murder or domestic violence, or it has those 4 or 5 really key components.
So the result might be the same. 10 people are killed, but the goal is maybe different. I read somewhere, it might have been in Mersheimer, that terrorist groups are typically those that lack the military power of a more dominant group that they're trying to terrorize. Like if Hezbollah had, tons of fighter jets and aircraft carriers and all these things, like they wouldn't resort to the kind of terror that they do. Would that be accurate? Most terrorist groups they would see themselves as an oppressed group with a more powerful country that they see themselves being oppressed by.
That's right. We had a colleague that recently passed away at Yale named Jim Scott, and James Scott's one of his famous ideas was that terrorism is a weapon of the weak. It's what people mobilize to resist when they are highly outmatched militarily, politically, economically. And so you see a lot of national liberation movements, including the State of Israel, the Haganah and Irgun and the militias that resisted the British mandate, engaged in terrorism toward an effort toward independence, national liberation. So it's a pretty common tactic that non-state groups use when they're trying to achieve a goal, whether that's self-determination, independence, ending an occupation.
Yeah.
Ukrainian resistance is targeting Russian civilians in Russia, right, in order to expel the Russian occupation of their country. Okay. So it's a pretty common tactic. Typically, you use it when you're outmatched militarily.
Now, the recent the pagers that were all detonated. Yeah. Would that in and of itself be a terrorist act? 'Cause that does seem to be like kind of a frightening thing. Or what's the goal of that? You just want to blow off body parts, but that would produce a lot of fear in me. Like, what am I carrying something that's going to blow up?
Yeah, it was a highly sophisticated effort at targeted assassination. So what the Israelis are highly effective at is identifying targets, whether they're high value targets leading the Iranian Revolutionary Guard or Hezbollah or Hamas, and they engage in precise strikes. And so the pager and walkie-talkies was this elaborate multi-year plot to target not only the leadership of Hezbollah, but the everyday rank and file fighters who adopted pagers because they realized that with smartphones, the Israelis could track them. So they thought an analog technology like pagers would keep them safe. Turns out that was not the case. Now, highly terrorizing, and the attack ended up killing civilians as well. But it was a discriminate, precise attack. That doesn't necessarily make it just or ethical or proportionate, but it was not an example of indiscriminate violence, of blowing up a bus in Jerusalem or toppling an apartment building in Gaza. Right?
Because the assumption
makes it different.
Got it. The assumption was that for strategic reasons, only militants are carrying pagers.
Right.
Okay. Can you take us back to and we're recording this on Thursday, October, 2nd?
The 3rd, yeah.
The 3rd. Oh, sorry, October 3rd. And I think we're going to try to rush this to be released, I think, Saturday the 5th. So people might be listening, but we're just a couple of days behind. So we could, by the time people listen to this, many things could happen in the next 48 hours. So, we just had a barrage of, I think, 180 missiles launched from Iran to Israel. That's a big deal. I don't know if there's been that extent of that kind of direct Iranian attack on Israel, at least in a while or ever. I don't know. Can you take us back? Where did this start? And you might want to go back to like 1953 or, or even farther. Maybe take us back to the last year. As I understand it, and here's the extent of my knowledge, that Hezbollah is upset at the way Israel is responding to Gaza, killing tons of civilians, and so they start kind of skirmishing and shooting rockets and everything. Israel retaliates, and it's just kind of a bit of back and forth the last almost year now. Would that be accurate, or how would you set the stage for understanding where did this thing start?
Yeah, so I think to tackle that, you can think about a couple different levels of analysis. You can think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can think about the regional war where you have states like Israel and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're all great powers aspiring for hegemony or influence in their region. And so what the Iranians have done, particularly since the revolution, there's a political revolution in 1979, which led to the creation of a theocratic government. And they realized because they were outmatched economically, politically, militarily, they had lots of oil and gas. Nonetheless, they were outmatched by the Americans, that they needed to develop a foreign policy that uses proxy forces to exert their influence in neighboring countries. And so they have a pretty weak conventional military, Army, Air Force, Navy, et cetera. They have a nascent weapons of mass destruction program. We're not sure if they reach breakout capacity, if they can actually deliver warheads on this missile technology, but they're certainly close. What they've opted for instead, especially how they compete with Israel, is by supporting non-state groups in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and in the West Bank and in Yemen. So all these non-state groups that were attacking Israel, not unconventionally, receive financial support, military support, intelligence support from Iran. And this is how Iran has tried to exert its influence. And what the Israelis figured out was the assumption was that the Israelis are going to discriminate or differentiate between civilian and military targets. And at some point, certainly in Gaza, and we've seen this in Lebanon, they said, well, no, we're going to terrorize the civilian population as a form of punishment for supporting Hamas or supporting Hezbollah. And so as soon as the Israelis decided that there was an acceptable level of civilian casualties, that actually undermined Iran's strategy of using these proxy forces. And that's how we've seen it escalate. We've seen over 40,000 plus casualties in Gaza. There's violence now in the West Bank and in southern Lebanon, millions of people, 1 million people displaced, massively heartbreaking consequences for civilians as the war's escalated. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If I ask who started it, is that how would you answer it? Would you say that's just impossible to answer? What does that even mean? Or
so it depends on where you start the timeline. And it depends on how you interpret key events in history.
Okay.
So if you read politics of the Middle East through a post-colonial lens, you think that the British and the Americans and the French involvement at regime change and trying to engineer different state governments after World War II wound up increased tension, kind of was the fuse that started these conflicts. If you think it's primarily about revolutionary ideologies, if you're strongly against the Iranian theocracy, you read the conflict through, well, this is a revolutionary regime committed to exterminate the state of Israel, not only exterminate the Israelis, but kill the Jews, either in the state of Israel or overseas. I'm a political scientist. I think more in terms of great power politics and the regional balance of power. And I read this as an attempt for regional hegemony. You have states competing for influence in a region where the American influence is waning. We don't see the Russians or Chinese intervening to restore order. And so there's what seems to be a power vacuum and regional states competing for influence. Obviously, it's still going to be important to the Americans and Europeans and Russians and Chinese because of the oil and gas in the Gulf. But one could imagine the Iranian response being predicated on fear, uncertainty, mistrust. They are highly threatened by the American presence, the Israeli military superiority, and they're doing what they can to defend the state against calls for regime change in Iran. So who started depends on what narrative you find most convincing in terms of the history of maybe the last 70 or 80 years, recent history. Yeah.
You're such a scholar. I need to ask some of my friends without PhDs their thoughts, and they give me something probably a lot more one-sided, probably on either side. And passionate.
Well, that means I'm not going to be on any major news channel soon.
I do. 1953. When and if I say anything that you find inaccurate, please let me know. When the United States was involved in a coup that overthrew a democratically elected leader in Iran and installed a Shah who was Western friendly, or at least able to work with the West. And he was brutal towards his people. That took him through decades of terrible. I mean, the U.S.-backed leader, the U.S.-backed Shah, was really bad towards his people, which led to the revolution, right, in 79.
Yeah.
The kidnapping of American, were they soldiers or civilians over there? They were
the embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis in 1979, 1980. Yeah.
And that's when the Americans like, oh, look how all these people hate us. They're kidnapping us. It's like, well, this is at the end of a 30-year U.S.-backed oppression in many ways. And so it was not right, obviously, but it was a response. It was a kind of blowback. Is that more or less correct?
I think that's right. Yeah. So one of the classic debates, especially in this part of the world, is are the responses of these governments, places like Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, are these responses to American foreign policy? Or are they responses based on some revolutionary, inherently violent ideology? And of course, it's not, reality is not that simple. It could be both and. But the U.S. history with Iran is one where there are extremely negative unintended consequences that always tend then to destabilize the U.S.-Iran relationship down the line. I mean, the Mohammad Mossadegh, the leader that was elected in 1953, was at the very least a socialist. The worry was that he's going to be a full-blown communist and he's going to ally with the Soviet Union. The Soviets are right there on the Iranian border. We can't have Soviet influence in the Middle East. Right. It's going to destabilize the region, and they're going to control oil and gas in the Persian Gulf. So that's a non-starter. So the Americans and Brits conspire then to overthrow this leader. They put in a really brutal monarch who terrorizes the population for 25 years. And then you have an equally brutal Iranian theocracy that comes to power that is highly illegitimate in the eyes of everyday Iranians. Iran is a young, vibrant, highly educated, secularizing society with a really, really fragile, archaic regime. And so the real worry is you destabilize this regime. Lots of people would love to see the mullahs go, the Ayatollah fall. Then what happens, right? How do states rebuild themselves in the aftermath of conflict? And what we've seen in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, now in South Lebanon and Gaza and the West Bank, is that states don't really have all that much control. External interveners can't really control how states recover or fail to recover from civil wars and insurgency. And so it's highly irresponsible now that the same folks in Washington that discredited themselves supporting the Iraq war are now calling for a preemptive attack against Iran for the Israelis and Americans to finish the job. It's just this hawkish, it's historical amnesia to an atrocious extent.
The rhetoric I'm seeing coming out of the White House is I'm glad you said that because that's how I feel. I mean, and you're the
Yeah.
expert. I'm just the armchair reader. Maybe I've read too much
Yeah.
John Mersheimer in the last year, so that he's kind of waved his wand over me. I absolutely think it's a response to American foreign policy. Which, when has that gone well? Maybe there's isolated incidents when the aftermath is good, but in most cases, regime changes, even if it's a bad leader or a potential communist leader or whatever, ends up leading to a worse situation. I don't, maybe there's exceptions to that.
External regime change, foreign imposed regime change seldom goes well. Internal revolutions are kind of roll the dice. Sometimes they improve the lives of people, other times they don't. But very difficult to rebuild states. Foreign imposed regime change.
Yeah. So going back to, so I think, people listen to podcasts and hopefully they're familiar with the Israel-Palestine issue over the last year. I wish people would be more familiar with it, but we kind of have an idea of what's going on October 7th, and then the response and the ongoing response, and but I think we're a lot less familiar with at the North what's going on. So October 7th happens, then October 8th, Israel starts their response. At that time, is that when Hezbollah starts just tell us the specifics. Like they start just shooting rockets across the border. Are they killing people? How is Israel responding? What's the last year like? The details of what the average person should understand what has happened. That has led to this kind of like really cataclysmic moment we're in right now.
Yeah, well, the Israelis, they ever since they've evacuated South Lebanon, they first went in 1982. During Lebanon civil war. They went back in 2006, fought for about 35 days before the UN imposed a ceasefire. There's been 30 plus years of cross-border skirmishes between the Israel Defense Forces and Hezbollah. Now, it's important. This is not against the Lebanese military, right? Tel Aviv is careful to say we're not fighting the Lebanese state. We're not fighting Lebanese civilians or the Lebanese army. We're fighting Hezbollah. The problem is Lebanon's government has very little control over that southern border. And so what you saw after October 7, 2003 was some initial rocket volleys from Hezbollah, but displacing 60,000 plus residents on that northern border, right? And so Israelis have been displaced for the better part of a year, not able to return to their homes because of violence on the border. Nonetheless, the Israelis until recently were very, very wary of fighting a multi-front war. Right, the nightmare scenario, if it's the morning of October 8th and you're in Tel Aviv, the nightmare scenario is that you're not only fighting in Gaza, but there's a renewed intifada in the West Bank, an armed resistance effort in the West Bank. Hezbollah gets involved in the north. You have the Houthis from Yemen launching rockets. The Israelis don't want to have to fight a 3, 4, 5 front war with all the regional states. It now seems that they have accepted the risk that comes with escalation. And they're saying, okay, we've been extraordinarily effective at targeting these Hezbollah militants. We're going to continue that offensive and introduce ground troops into South Lebanon. Now they're saying this is going to be a limited incursion into Lebanon, only special forces. We're not going to occupy. But we've seen this story before in 2006, 1982, and before that once you get involved in a military occupation of South Lebanon, it does not go well for the Israelis. Very, very difficult to defeat these groups. Not to say that they've made progress. Right? They've killed the top 3 echelons of the organization. They've decapitated Hezbollah, but Hezbollah still has tens of thousands of rockets of various capacity and effectiveness, but there's still a significant military threat.
Were you surprised at Iran sending 180 rockets over? Like, was that? Because it seems like that's a really big deal. Is that a big deal? I mean, has that been done before?
So we saw that last April, the first volley after the targeted assassination of a Hamas leader in Tehran. The response was a volley of rockets in April. Most of them did very little damage. There's a few casualties. This time there seems to be casualties in the single digits, including a Palestinian in the West Bank who was killed by rocket debris. And Jordanians, right? The rockets have to go over Jordan, and so some of them intercepted. That poses a risk to the citizens of Jordan as well. And so what you see is this is I think a calculated tit for tat kind of armed form of bargaining. Right? This is all war is politics by other means. This is a political negotiation where there's a very calculated tit for tat between the Israelis. And now Iranians want to respond in order to protect their reputation. They don't want to look weak, not only in front of the Israelis or Americans, they don't want to look weak in front of their own people, right? Because if you're an autocracy, you're worried about internal revolution or coup as much as your regional states or regional adversaries. And so there's a very difficult balance that the Ayatollah has to do in Iran to make sure his regime isn't overthrown. At the same time, as you have this tit for tat, the real fear is not calculated escalation, but accidental escalation, right? That there's so many examples in international politics where you have these spirals where neither state wants to get involved in an active conventional war with one another, but nonetheless, they wind up escalating. They wind up in a situation where neither state wants to fight, but yet they're confronting the reality of a war. So these security dilemma dynamics are all over the place. And that's really what worries me. Not that there's a calculated walk up the escalation ladder, but something's going to happen that where the war escalates, where it's actually beyond the control of Iran or Israel to then de-escalate. And so Washington, the Biden administration has been highly ineffective at restraining the Israelis, deterring Iran from further actions. We're sending aircraft carriers, more military forces to the Gulf. I'm not sure that's actually going to deter further Iranian action. And for me, my read is that these are examples, or what we're witnessing is foreign policy coming out of Iran's weakness as a military power, not their strength.
So many questions. The guy that Israel killed in Iran, the Hamas leader in April,
Haniya.
Was he?
Yeah, Haniya.
Was he like a negotiator? He wasn't like a militant, was he? Or wasn't he more like their primary negotiator or something?
Yeah, he was the head of the political party, of the political wing of Hamas. So just like Hezbollah, there's a political wing and a military wing. The political wing has been in exile in Qatar. They're supported by Turkey. Some of them have gone, go to Egypt then to negotiate. And so typically the Israelis and Americans and regional states negotiate with the political party Hamas and not the armed party. The problem is, turns out the armed party, the armed wing of Hamas had their own political agenda. It's unclear to what extent the political leadership of Hamas knew the October 7th attacks were coming. We just don't know. But Sinwar and the militants in Gaza escalated, and then the Israelis had an opportunity to take out Haniya and the other senior political leaders, and that undermined negotiations in Doha to de-escalate the conflict. When you're killing negotiators among your adversaries' ranks, that doesn't really bode well for ceasefire negotiations, right?
If there was, in your opinion, in your educated opinion, if there was an actual ceasefire in Israel, in Gaza, like permanent, like we're done, would that basically also end the conflict in the north and Iran? Would they be like, all right, that's what we're wanting, and so no more rockets? Or is it hard to predict that?
Yeah, there would certainly be a pause in fighting. I know, who knows, if it would be a permanent ceasefire. That one of my basic rule of thumbs is anyone that claims to be a Middle East expert that confidently predicts the future is a fool. So, you don't want to talk to those folks. I think if I'm interpreting what's going on in Tel Aviv correctly, what's happening is the Israelis say, okay, we've done this time and time again, where we fight for a limited time. There's a ceasefire that just puts a pause on an inevitable conflict between Israel and Iran. Now they're on the offensive. We're securing some military victories. We need to just finish the job because we're tired of this proxy thing back and forth, decades-long kind of Cold War between Israel and these proxy groups. We need to go in and rout the groups and finish the job. The problem is it's very difficult to stomp out these organizations. And even when you do, the ideology is still around people's. My sense is that the ramifications of this war, especially the Israeli incursion in Gaza, this is going to be a decades-long trauma for these populations, and it's going to motivate future generations of armed resistance. And so I think the Israelis are trying to resolve a fundamentally political conflict with military means in a way that secures some lasting victory. And I just don't think that's the case. I don't think these political problems are solved by preemptive war.
As you've read the situation with the ceasefire negotiations that I think have happened, I mean, all throughout the last year between Israel and Gaza, right? I mean, and there's different people involved. Why hasn't that happened? Who is the one saying no to the negotiations? Who's been the problem? Has it been Israel? Has it been Hamas? Is it a both and? I imagine you're not going to give me a simple answer to that.
Yeah. So what happens in any negotiation, this is one of the through lines of Israel-Palestinian conflict in the last, since 1967, is that you have negotiating parties who are then undermined by folks within their own ranks that have more extreme goals. And so you have spoilers, both within, in the case of Palestine, you have the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah party trying to negotiate a two-state solution during Oslo in the 1990s. Hamas comes in and spoils that deal, right? That they have more extreme political goals or expanded goals. And so they have a political incentive in the short term to undermine that negotiation. I think you've seen that both with Hamas and certainly the Netanyahu coalition, where the Americans and Qataris and other regional states bring both parties to bear to the negotiating table. And Netanyahu realizes that his only stake at political survival of staying in office and keeping the coalition together is to appear strong, defeat Hamas, and perhaps release the remaining hostages who are alive. We're unsure whether or not the Netanyahu government is committed to that, right? And so you have leaders who want to stay in power. If they look weak, they're guessing that they're going to undermine their authority. They're going to lose power. In that case, the Israeli coalition falls apart, and Netanyahu loses power, and then he's subject to legal prosecution. He may find his way in jail for the corruption charges and other legal disputes that are ongoing. So Netanyahu thinks the best way to avoid that is to keep the government together, and that those personal incentives of Netanyahu and some of the Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar included, undermine the public interest of the groups they represent. So Sinwar wants to maintain control. He wants to continue resistance efforts. We're actually unsure if he's still alive at this point. We're not entirely clear. Those efforts to continue armed resistance undermine the protection of Palestinian people in Gaza. Right?
Wow. Yeah,
so the private incentives of leaders clash with the public incentives of the people they're supposed to represent.
That's the fundamental problem with. Yeah. When I put my Christian hat on, that's.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people see this in binary terms, like Israel as an entity versus Hamas as an entity. And if you frame it that way, of course, you're going to side with Israel. No one's going to side with Hamas. I mean, a few people do. But I'm like, well, what about the overwhelming majority of civilians that are just caught in the middle, that are not, there may be complex reasons for, a Palestinian voting for Hamas, back in 2005 or 6, but even that, like, people hold the civilians responsible for that. Well, that's the logic of Osama bin Laden, who bombed the Twin Towers, because it was a population that put these, hawkish militants in leadership of the White House. So you don't bomb civilians because they voted for a government you don't like. I mean, that's just not. Again, that's the logic of terrorism, I think. So I mean, I on both sides of all sides of the borders, we have not only Christians all over the place. Middle East is one of the fastest growing evangelical Christian movements. In Iran, the house church movement in Iran. Insane. Led by women.
Yes.
Led by women. I'm a friend who's a female, one of the early leaders of the house church movement in Iran. She goes, there's no explanation. Yes. It is the most patriarchal society.
It's the upside down church, right? Or the Brennan Manning idea of like the gospel will advance regardless of the foreign policy of great powers. And you've seen this revival in Iran, a place where missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries 120 plus years ago were planting seeds. And now you have just the explosion of the church, and you have really passionate Iranian or Persian diaspora believers in London and in Southern California witnessing the folks. There's a great podcast, Jesus Speaks Farsi, that has Christian, the folks that run that interview Christians both inside and outside of Iran, looking at the dynamics of the church, and just so encouraging. These folks will return to Iran to visit family. They'll distribute New Testaments, and inside the cover of these Bibles, Persian language Bible, will be a Zoom link. And they say, hey, if you're reading stuff here and you have questions, every Monday night or whatever, we're going to be on the Zoom link. We'd love to talk to you about what you're reading. And so there's just this subversive evangelism going on of Persians outside of Iran. And that's the greatest hope for the Persian people. Not a regime change, not a regional war, not a fall of the Ayatollah. All those things would be great. But the church is going to thrive regardless of who the head of state is. That includes the church and Anyway,
talk to us. What's going on in Lebanon with the church? I know Lebanon has always had a strong Christian population. Beirut has always seemed to have like serious Christian activity going on. Can you help us understand what's God doing there?
Yeah, so Lebanon's it's a really interesting place, right? It's has a strong kind of Mediterranean culture. It's half Mediterranean, European, half Arab, Middle Eastern, and it's a country that has the largest Christian plurality. So something like a third of the country are at least by social identity Christians. Not all of them are active churchgoers, but you have a lot of active denominations. The Maronite Church is an Eastern Catholic church, so they're in fellowship with Rome, but also have their own liturgy. A lot of these places, I visited these monasteries in Bakad, the Central Valley, where you can go and visit and sit in Vespers that are in Aramaic. So they're about the closest you can hear to the language that Jesus spoke.
Oh my
is
word.
This Lebanese Aramaic. It's an incredible experience. Lord willing, we'll be able to go back there in the years ahead and listen to this. It's incredible, right? And so you have the historic denominations there. A lot of folks don't know much about them. These are the denominations that kind of lost the debate over the Council of Chalcedon. These Eastern churches that the West kind of uses heretical because of some of their beliefs. I think Vince Bantu at Fuller has a great book kind of sorting out the history of the Eastern Church. I'd recommend that book. But nowadays you have a thriving evangelical presence in places like Beirut. So you have the Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in Beirut that's training pastors within the country, Arab-speaking believers, as well as those from Sub-Saharan Africa. It's easier and closer to get a visa to go to Lebanon than Europe or North America. And so they're training pastors throughout the region. And there's obviously there's great non-denominational seminaries in Bethlehem and in Nazareth and in Amman, Jordan. And so these are, when we get focused on the great power politics of the region, we forget or we lose sight of the brothers and sisters in this part of the world that are barely hanging on. They're doing the Lord's work. And we tend not to visit these folks when we, like when people go to Israel, or maybe they go to Bethlehem for 3 hours. They go to the Church of the Nativity, they have lunch, and they get back on the bus and cross the checkpoint. And they don't talk to her. They don't talk to Arab Christians in Nazareth. Right?
Yeah.
And so we keep these folks in our prayer and really build relationships with them, because this is the birthplace of Christianity. What's going to happen if we sit by and allow politics to really erode or extinguish the presence of the church in these communities? These are churches that have been around since the first century.
I just looked up the countries with the fastest growing Christian population. Saudi Arabia was top 3 or 4 too. Do you know Ferris Abraham? He was on the podcast a month ago.
Yeah, I know of him. Yeah.
Okay, gosh, he's doing amazing work. He sent me pictures of, like, in I think it was in Egypt. Was it Saudi? No, I think it was Egypt. This like massive auditorium filled with youth. It's like a youth event with like thousands of people gathering, praising Jesus in the middle of Egypt. Or maybe it was Saudi. It was some place where he's like, there's no explanation for this. God is doing some crazy stuff.
There's a fairly large Protestant church and center in Cairo. These aren't Coptic Christians, but they're Protestant Egyptian Christians, small minority, but it's a really thriving congregation in the middle of Cairo as well. Yeah, so there's pockets of this growth all over the place, and then there's examples of revival in Iran. I mean, it's telling that organizations like the Gospel Coalition here in the United States, they have a Persian language site. They're translating some of those resources into Persian so that people can read it in their own language, right? That's what keeps me encouraged. And these are indigenous or local pastors movements that are the legacy in part of Western missions, but they're also now training local pastors, folks that are going from Dearborn, Michigan, back to Lebanon or Iraq or Egypt, right, to witness to their congregations. And they inherently have more legitimacy because they're from the region, they speak the language. I'm highly encouraged by that.
As Christians, we just need to not turn off the news, but change the channel. You know what I mean? Like, we get so sucked into the power politics and the narratives and the propaganda, and different narratives want to suck you into their political side, when God is doing some crazy, amazing things in this very same region. And there's obviously an intersection here when this war is breaking out. Who knows where it's going to lead? I mean, that could be devastating for our brothers and sisters in Christ. Like in Iraq.
We treat it as entertainment, right? For the most part, Americans in particular have been insulated from the costs of war, especially the war on terror. And so we view these things through the lens of entertainment. We think this is some live action risk game where we can choose sides and follow on our Twitter feeds and get excited about all this military technology as opposed to reality. And this is really heartbreaking stuff. We have the luxury of treating this as news because we're insulated from the effects of it.
Right.
And that's just, I think it's spiritually poisonous for us to view this as entertainment.
Is Iran any threat to America? If Israel was not America's ally, say Israel is just a country over there, whatever, is Iran, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas, are they a threat to people living in America?
Historically, they have been. So there's been global terrorism by Hamas and Hezbollah, U.S. embassies or Israeli embassies overseas, American and European civilians in Europe and elsewhere. So historically, it's been a global terror threat. I think in terms of, you think about the security of the American people, the vibrancy of our economy, the promotion of our values at home and overseas, Iran is not in the top 5 threats that the U.S. faces in terms of foreign policy priorities. But the problem is we can't, just like similar to the North Koreans, the fact that they have a progressing nuclear weapons program makes them a global security threat. And so the priority should be, how do we contain, disrupt, negotiate with the Iranians in order to prevent this breakout capacity? The Iran deal, I think, was marginally successful. The Trump administration pulled out of that once he was elected in 2016, 2017. What are the alternative foreign policies? Very, very difficult to tell. My sense is that regime change or more military aggression is not going to deter. In fact, if I'm sitting in Tehran and I'm advising the Ayatollah, I'm saying, listen, the Israelis have been able to counteract all of our proxy forces. This motivates us all the more to develop and deploy and advance nuclear weapon capacity. This is the only chance we have at life insurance for the regime. Right? That's one of the lessons the Iranians learned from the American wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, is that nuclear weapons are the only form of life insurance you have against overthrow by foreign governments. I think it's the same strategy the North Koreans are pursuing. It's the only means they have of preventing foreign imposed regime change. And I'm not morally justifying that foreign policy, but you can, if you put yourself in the position of these states and their foreign policy, you can understand why that makes strategic sense. Morally tragic, but there's a logic to it, right?
I like to distinguish between something that's moral and something that's rational or reasonable. Like something could be reasonable and be immoral too. Is that? I mean, yeah. So
I think our moral reasoning when it comes to these things, especially when we think about just war, just cause for war, proportionate, we collapse these distinctions or categories, because what we want is, our brains don't like cognitive dissonance. We want some closure. We want some definitive answer. We don't like ongoing curiosity or uncertainty. And that especially Christian, evangelical Christians have a difficult time with that curiosity or dissonance. And so that's one of my missions, is to train Christians to think well about these things and be comfortable in that cognitive dissonance.
So
not to remain there, right? But to
as you said, there's been ongoing skirmishes, conflicts, really intense things like the 1982 and Second Intifada. So lots of things that have escalated and turned into really big deals. Do you see our situation right now as bigger than all of that? Potentially, I mean, people have talked about the potential of nuclear war, the way the hawkish people in Washington are talking about responding. I mean, could it, what are the odds this could actually lead to nuclear war? Are you at all worried about that? Or if not nuclear war, some full on big war in the Middle East that we haven't seen, at least in a long time? Like, are you worried? Like, are you concerned, particularly concerned right now?
Well, it's already escalated, right? There's a war between Israel and Lebanon. Now the Iranians are involved, proxy forces elsewhere. So the war is escalating. In the Middle East context, I'm not so much worried about a nuclear escalation. I don't know if the Iranians actually I don't think they have the incentive or the ability to deliver nuclear weapons. Israel has a secure nuclear deterrent, probably submarine-based, very difficult to take that out. At the same time, I highly doubt that the Israelis and the Americans have the ability, the military capability or strategy in place to totally wipe out Iran's nuclear weapons program. They've built these facilities under mountains to be insulated from attack from the air. And so the folks that are calling for a strike, I think, are highly underestimating the unintended consequence of that, and probably overestimating the likelihood that a preemptive strike could eliminate the program. And so what happens if you take out half the program, or I'm far more worried about a collapsing Iranian regime or a weak regime, the types of things that a weak Iran's going to do, than one that feels secure. Not to say that Iranian foreign policy is not pernicious and they have their own goals and it's against the U.S. national interest in a lot of ways, but I think it's highly strategically and morally callous or reckless. Brent Stevens, the New York Times yesterday, talking about this is the time now to strike the regime, and it's terrifying to me.
How can you be so stupid? I could just I'm not an expert in this stuff, but it's just like, it's like you said, like historical amnesia. Like, yeah, we've tried that many times, hasn't gone well. Like, what makes you think that overpowering power and more power right now, or preemptive power, is going to do anything positive? Anyway, you know what we need is Tom Cruise to jump in an airplane and go take out the nuclear weapons being built. How do you think, last question, how do you think Israel, like right now, Israel's going to respond? Usually they respond with a lot more power than what was, than the attack on them. That's a little scary because that was a pretty big barrage of missiles. How do you think Israel's going to respond? They might have already responded by the time this podcast comes out.
Yeah, so they're continuing the incursion into South Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah assets. I would suspect they would want to avoid a prolonged military occupation of South Lebanon, though we know how these things escalate. A lot of times foreign militaries go in expecting to leave sooner rather than later, and that's not the case. And think about Vietnam, right? As early as 1962, 1963, the Americans go in, and they wind up stuck there. Israelis have experience with that 2006, 1982, beforehand. There seems to be relative pause in the fighting in Gaza. I don't think that's by any means a permanent ceasefire. Time will tell. To be totally honest, I'm not entirely sure the path forward. It strikes me, at least the public presence of the Biden administration is not reassuring. I'm not sure entirely who's doing the negotiating behind the scenes, if that's Secretary of State Tony Blinken or perhaps Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor. But the sooner that the Americans, Europeans, Qataris can get to the region and figure out a sequential de-escalation, the better. And that includes bringing the Israelis to the table. To date, the American approach of where we're going to give the Israelis a bear hug, prevent them from hurting themselves or other people, that foreign policy approach hasn't worked. And I think Netanyahu is basically immune to that. And he's fighting, much like what we see in Russia and Ukraine. They're banking on a favorable U.S. election in the next 5 weeks. That both Netanyahu and Putin think they're going to get a better deal if the Trump administration comes back to power. So if they can hold out until the U.S. election here in the next month, their prospects in terms of negotiating with the Americans will improve. And so that's what's really concerning at this point is the incentive to keep fighting, at least low-level fighting, until the U.S. election in Washington, the U.S. elections, the results are clear. That's bad news for the Palestinians, bad news for Ukrainians, and Israelis elsewhere. Yeah.
Now, sorry, one more question. I'd love to get your read on this, because since you brought up the election and everything, it's shocking to me how hawkish the Biden administration. Well, it's shocking, but not like. It used to be just Republicans that were the warmongers and everything, and I think since Clinton, it's kind of pretty bipartisan. It seems like, but what's shocking to me is, and this the election's so volatile. So if people could just set aside, we're just talking about foreign policy right now. It is shocking that Trump said he's surrounding himself with some pretty anti-war people, like a Tulsi Gabbard, even RFK. Like, these guys are openly kind of speaking out against the military-industrial complex, not getting involved in proxy wars, pulling funding from different wars we're involved in. Depending on your view of foreign policy, you can think that's good or bad. I tend to think that's good. So if Trump gets elected and he actually does put, say, Gabbard and RFK in positions of power that are very anti-war, at least verbally they've been that way, could that in of itself, do you see that as being potentially good thing, or do you just not believe anything?
You saw that, yeah. You saw it the other night with the vice presidential debate on October 1st, just a few nights ago. The first question out the gate was on Iran. J.D. Vance, who typically portrays himself as a non-interventionist, comes out strongly pro-Israel. I think that Trump likes Netanyahu because he sees the fellow wheeler and dealer, someone he can negotiate with. Now, Trump is also mercurial enough to not want to be slighted, right? If he's a narcissist, he doesn't want to be slighted. He actually may be far more unpredictable when it comes to Netanyahu. And that's kind of the dark counter argument, is that Trump would actually be better for Israel, Gaza, than Biden. Because if he feels slighted, he might just end up changing his mind. I don't really think Trump has foreign policy priorities. I think he has personal priorities that are highly transactional. And if those circumstances change, he doesn't really have a commitment to backing Israel any more than he has a commitment to staying in NATO. So, that's kind of the dark argument, is that if Trump gets in power, there's actually a better chance at restraining the Israelis than with Biden or Vice President Harris. I think that uncertainty, that instability is not good for the American presence in the world or the region. But the fact that Biden and Harris, they've been highly ineffective in the war. And you're seeing this in terms of Michigan. Arab American voters in Michigan, there's a high chance that 10, 20, 30,000 folks in Michigan are going to stay home. I don't think the Arab Americans are going to vote Trump. They're going to stay home. And then if Michigan goes to Trump, if it's a close election, that lack of turnout could be one of the very few examples we have where a foreign policy issue actually decides elections. Most of the time, foreign policy is not even in the top 10 issues, right? Unless the Americans are at war, most of us don't vote on Middle East politics, let alone foreign policy writ large. We vote on the economy, if we're a red or blue team, maybe abortion or social issues. But this may be one of those rare examples where this war actually will prevent Harris from winning in Michigan. Would surprise me.
Yeah, everything you're saying is exactly what I've been thinking, but I'm not the expert, so I'm glad to hear that, because I'm trying to piece together stuff and it seems like if this, then this, and what you said, like the Biden/Harris administration seems to be so deep in, people don't like the term deep state or whatever, but I just think they're too well funded by AIPAC and the lobbyists and people of billions of dollars. And, to me, it's like they are going to be committed Zionists no matter what. They have the whole problem of the far left that's, sympathetic with the Palestinians, and they have to kind of navigate that on a voter level. But at the end of the day, they are 100% committed to supporting Israel unconditionally. We've seen that over and over and over. With Trump, his craziness is a role that it's a bit of a crapshoot. Like you said, I'm just kind of repeating what you said. Like, he's committed to Israel. He says he's committed to Israel, but I don't know. He's kind of unpredictable. And in most ways, it's bad, his unpredictability. This way, it could be good, especially if he has Gabbard and RFK and people around him. But JD Vance definitely sounded hawkish in that debate. Yeah, the very first question.
Well, and he's incredibly clever. At the same time, he knows how to speak to different audiences. So I'm not actually sure what his political or foreign policy priorities are, because he's very effective at switching tones and tact depending on who he's talking to. So the J.D. Vance you saw on Tuesday night, the debate, is not the one you see at the rallies. He tries to portray a consistent non-interventionist ethic, but then is strongly pro-Israel. Other than being an opportunist, I'm not really sure where those priorities in terms of foreign policy, what that would look like in January should they win the election.
But and then you have, he's not a politician, but he's got massive influence. Tucker Carlson holding these rallies where he's been very. Look, people, I know when I say that's a trigger word, and I hate that all these names, or people have all kinds of strong opinions about whatever. But like despite what people might think about Tucker Carlson, and I'm not a fan, he's been very anti-war in his rhetoric, very anti-war. And when he says anti-war things in front of these massive far-right audiences, they all stand up and cheer. It's weird, man. I mean, you still have, obviously, the Republicans and the Blinkens. And Blinken. I mean, you have these very hawkish people in positions of power in the Republican Party, no doubt about that. And those people frighten me to no end. But there's this weird groundswell of right-wing populists that are now, partly because of people like Carlson and Gabbard and RFK, that are being anti-war, which is... There's a strong American tradition.
The American history, there's a strong tradition of anti-intervention, non-interventionism. It typically comes in populist forms. Sometimes that's rather pernicious. You think about Charles Lindbergh, the America First campaign to prevent the Americans from getting involved in World War II. But public opinion until 1945, and especially after the end of the Cold War, has been traditionally there's been a sizable percentage of folks that are highly skeptical of U.S. empire, of liberal hegemony, and that's I think the foreign policy of liberal hegemony. John and others have talked at length about this. That it is not a partisan issue. You have the neoconservative or conservative version of it in George W. Bush. You have the progressive version of it under Clinton, Obama, now Biden. There is universal consensus towards this. I had an advisor with my Ph.D., a guy named John Mueller, really bright guy. He would go to D.C. and would talk about this. And his joke was he'd always, anytime he had a new book and would kind of push the non-interventionist line, he was always invited to speak in Congress or a think tank once, and he was never invited back because people didn't like to hear what he had to say. So he said, I'll come out and speak, but this is not going to, you're not going to want to have me back. But
it never is.
Because there's an elite consensus committed to liberal hegemony, and there's a populist impulse both on the progressive left and the populist right against that. And I think you actually have more in common. That non-interventionist groundswell has more in common. And it just shows that you can't really use the left, right, conservative, progressive thing when you think about foreign policy. These issues don't map onto these domestic cleavages as well as they do when you talk about like abortion or immigration or taxes. Right? They just doesn't make sense to think about foreign policy in terms of left and right.
Jeffrey Sachs has been saying this, Columbia University prof. Yep. He says when it comes to war and foreign policy and war profiteering, it's the two parties are on the same side. It's he says Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's been my read of it. I'm like, golly, if I was a one issue voter, I might. I don't know. I think American foreign policy is not just one of many issues. I think it is one that is like a magnet. It controls so many other decisions. Again, from my very limited reading on the situation, the kind of war profiteering and the intertwining of big corporations that are making decisions in Washington, and the war profiteering, the revolving door between people involved with Raytheon and all these weapons manufacturers and the government and everything. I don't know. It's a little eerie when you peek behind the curtain just a little bit. Yeah,
Eisenhower's speech on this, the State of the Union, the last major speech he gave before he left office. It's a great. I taught on it last week or 2 weeks ago to my students in my foreign policy class. It's a great speech to go back, and I think it's highly prescient about what are the consequences of collusion between big business, big government, and big military.
I just
example of a welfare state. Yeah. Similar take.
The Profits of War. He traces what's the company? I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, William Hartung, The Profits of War, analyzes the military industrial complex, the kind of from the roots all the way to present day. It's a decade old book, but super interesting and frightening too.
It's an important part of what you guys, when you're thinking about exiles in Babylon and political theology, I think thinking carefully about that. How does the political theology of foreign policy fit within this broader framework? Now, a lot of folks, the Hauerwas, et cetera, you have some of the anti-war line, but there's not a lot of folks that have carefully integrated that political theology into a broader framework of either pacifism or non-intervention or just challenging some of the just war, the kind of the knee-jerk just war arguments in favor of what we're seeing. Obviously, you could have a just cause for reprisal or a response to October 7th. That doesn't mean you're going to conduct the war in a just and proportionate fashion.
Right.
And so we confuse just cause with just conduct of the war.
Austin, I've taken you longer than I was anticipating. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you and your wisdom and for coming on the show at the last second. So
sure thing.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.